Hello, I'm Bill Monroe, and welcome to 2-Minute Talk Tips. This week's tip, be thankful. It's Thanksgiving week here in the United States as I'm recording this episode. You know, as speakers, we have a lot to be thankful for. It's easy to think, though, that it's all about us, since we're the ones who are up there on that stage or standing in the front of that conference room or looking for food in that strange town late at night, and you go to the mini mart and pick up some microwavable soup because you know there's a microwave in your room, and you get back to your room and it turns out you don't actually have a spoon. Yeah, that's sort of life as a speaker. But it's not just about us. We're not actually alone. We're part of a team. And whether we do it from the stage or whether we do it before or after a presentation, it's important to be thankful. And remember to thank the folks who help us do what we do. And there's quite a variety in the folks who do. They include folks like the event or meeting organizers, the ones who go ahead and set this up for us and give us an opportunity to come out there and speak. They include the SMEs or subject matter experts who help us with our content, and the editors who go ahead and make sure we don't misspell things in our slides. They include the event host, the on-site people at an event or at a meeting who may introduce us or get us to the place that we need to be in that building. At larger events, they include the AV team, the audiovisual team, and they're the folks who can make you look and sound very good or not so good. And of course, the most important group of folks to thank is our audience. The audience is ultimately the reason that we're there. They're giving us something very precious. They're giving us their time and their attention. And so it's important to go ahead and thank the audience. And I thank you, all of my listeners out there in the 2-Minute Talk Tips community. Your downloads are the reason that I continue to do this every week. So thank you. And stick around. After the break, we're going to talk about the structure of a presentation. I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and one of my favorite toys as a little kid was a set of wooden building blocks. Now, these weren't like plastic or lightweight or balsa wood or soft foam or anything like that. These were solid wood blocks that if you swung at somebody, you could do some serious damage with these things. There were long ones and short ones and triangles and arches and even round pillars. I used to enjoy building buildings with them. Now, sometimes if I was super careful, I could take the long, thinner ones and stack them end upon end and build just a really thin, tall tower. Of course, usually once I started doing that, it would collapse by the time I got to the third or fourth or fifth brick, which is why I think there's still a picture floating around of me and my little brother standing next to one of these towers wearing Bell System hard hats. But if instead of building just that long, thin tower, I actually took the blocks and arranged them in squares and interlinked them and cross-laid them and gradually started wider and made it narrower as I went up, I built a much more stable tower that wasn't going to collapse as easily. Of course, I still wore the helmet because it was just super cool. But not only was that tower stronger and more stable, it was also a lot more visually interesting. The difference between those two constructions was structure. It's actually right in the name of construction. How often have you sat through a presentation that had no structure? It would go from topic to topic, rambling on with a collection of possibly important stuff, but at the end you don't really remember all the details, and more importantly, you don't really remember the point or what the speaker wanted you to do. That's the type of talk that simply has no structure. So whenever you prepare a presentation, I want you to think about the structure of it. So over the next few minutes, I'm going to talk more about structure in presentations. I'll talk about what structure is. I'll talk about why structure matters. And finally, I'll talk about how structure goes along with signposting. So to start, What is structure in a presentation? Well, one way to think of it is that it's basically an outline. It sort of comes out of the development process as you're building your presentation. Your presentation has a main idea at its core, or a call to action, or a purpose, or a WIFM, or what's in it for me, or WBTU, or why bring that up, or simply that main idea is the why of what you're talking about. Why are you there today? Why should everyone give you their attention? The structure is also the points that support or explore that main idea or that call to action. And then the structure is also the details that support each of those points, that support that broader why or that broader call to action. You could think of it sort of like a pyramid or like a corporate org chart. We've got more wider elements down at the bottom that all work together to support that main point at the top. On a more tactical level, the structure is why one topic or slide fits where it does in the presentation. As you look at your slides, or as you look at the things you want to talk about, ask yourself, why does slide 17 come after slide 16, but before slide 18? And if you don't know why that point is where it is in the presentation, how it fits into the overall narrative, why that context matters, then you probably have a problem with the structure of that presentation. One of the reasons I talk so much about proper preparation for a presentation, and try saying that a bunch of times, it's probably going to be a good warm-up routine for the next time you actually go out on stage, is that good prep matters. It makes structure easier. With good prep, you know what your main idea is, and you know what you want to do to support it, and you have an outline. And once you have that outline, it's easy to build your talk around that and to go ahead and design your slides around that. Essentially, by the time you go ahead and open up PowerPoint or Keynote or Google Slides, you already know what's going on all up there, and all you're doing is filling in the blanks on the slides. It makes it so much easier for you to do your job when you have good prep work and good structure. So let's talk more in detail about why structure matters. There are really 8 reasons about why structure matters that I'm going to talk about today. First, it makes it easier to build and review your content. Second, it makes it easier to balance your topics. Third, it makes it easier for you to find and eliminate irrelevant stuff from your presentation. Fourth, it makes it easier to judge the timing of your presentation. Fifth, it makes it easier to go ahead and punt a section of your presentation if you have to. 6, it makes it easier to retain your content for both you and your audience. 7, it makes it easier for your audience to follow your train of thought and to follow your presentation. And finally, 8th, it makes it easier for your audience to take action. So let's go ahead and unpack those a little bit. First, it makes it easier to build and review your presentation. Good structure means you already have a good outline. And with that good structure in place, the hard work is done because you know what you're trying to accomplish and you know how you're going to get there and how you're going to be able to accomplish it. It means that as you build out your presentation and as you build out the slides that will go along with that presentation, you're no longer looking at just a collection of slides. You're able to break things down into different sections and topics and arguments and review your content that way. It makes it not only easier for you to look at all these different elements, plus it makes it easier for anyone who's going to go ahead and review or edit your slide deck to see what you're doing, to look at it section by section and to see the flow of your argument and the position that you're taking, instead of just seeing one slide after another without any context on each individual slide or component of your talk. Second, it makes it easier to balance your topics. When you have a strong structure, you can see that in an outline. You can see that ultimately in the slide deck that you're using. You can see that in the presentation you give as you're rehearsing. And if, for example, your second point is suddenly taking up 50, 60, 70% of your presentation, that will become obvious. You will see that that one point is dominating your entire discussion. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm not saying each point has to have the same amount of time in your presentation. But if it doesn't, you need to understand why. And you need to be able to go ahead and take a look at it and make that decision and say, okay, that's right. This does make sense. This is the most important or most complicated topic. It should be 80% of my time. Or you can look at it and say, wait, why is this point taking up 80% of the time? That doesn't make sense given the importance of the other stuff. Having a good structure lets you actually see that so that then you can make the appropriate decisions about how you want to balance your material. Third, it's easier to find irrelevant material. Back in the early 2000s, I was part of a group of folks who tried to make a short film. I was working with John Clark, the host of the Caffeinated Comics podcast, whom you may also remember from several episodes ago where we talked about comedy and music performance on stage, and we also talked about how to run a panel at a convention. But John and some other friends of ours got together and we decided to make a movie about the dynamics of a comedy duo called the Zany Boys. And we wrote a whole bunch of little sketches and little sections for this film, and we thought each of these was pretty darn funny. We were rather proud of ourselves. And we got together about 20 or 30 people in multiple cities and actually shot all of this together and then put it together into one movie and screened it for some of our friends. It was 27 minutes long and we were proud of that. Unfortunately, the audience didn't really appreciate it. It turns out that it wasn't actually funny. See, all these individual components seemed really funny and we got the joke. But the whole thing didn't actually become funny until several cuts later, and John ultimately produced a version of the film that was mildly entertaining at about 5 minutes long. Do you have stuff in your presentations that you like to talk about? Stories that you like to tell, facts you like to bring up, arguments you like to make that don't actually belong there? They can be brilliant observations, they can be touching stories, but if they don't move your argument forward, if they don't move the audience towards that call to action, maybe they're not really relevant. If you don't have good structure to your presentation, if you just have a series of points that you're making throughout your time, then that less relevant stuff is going to stay in there because you enjoy delivering it, even if it probably shouldn't. When you have good structure behind a presentation and you see your main point and your supporting points and the points that support those supporting points, that's when you start to see that, some of these stories, some of these slides, some of these bits, some of these 5-minute sections of the Zany Boys really don't belong in there. And it becomes even more obvious that you need to cut this stuff, even if it has a special place in your heart. And that's one more way that having strong structure in your presentation can help prevent you from rambling. Fourth, having good structure in your presentation makes it easier for you to judge the timing of your different sections. This is similar to what I talked about just a couple of moments ago, where we talked about balancing different sections. But when you're trying to figure out how long a presentation is and how much time it's going to take you to get through the different pieces that you want to talk about, having just a series of points, 20, 30, 40 points that you're trying to make over the course of your 30, 45, 60 minutes, whatever it is, it becomes real difficult to judge that, how much time you're going to spend with each and every point. But when you have good structure on your presentation, then you can see that, okay, maybe out of 30 minutes, I'm going to spend, 5 minutes on the introduction, then I'm going to spend 8 minutes on the first point and 9 minutes on the second point, and the remaining time on however other many points in conclusion that I want to do. It becomes a lot easier for you to evaluate how that's going to fit in versus if you've just got 20 slides and try to figure out how that is going to fit into that 30-minute presentation. That clear structure means you're not starting your time management by looking at each 30 to 60 second block. Instead, you're looking at the main points that you're trying to make and trying to allocate the timing around them. And that also then makes it easier when you have different amounts of time that you could present a similar topic in. So, for example, at some events, you might have to deliver content in 15 minutes. In another event, you may have 45 minutes. A good structure allows you to expand and contract different sections of your presentation and to know how you'll expand and contract those different sections of your presentation before you even begin. So it becomes a really valuable tool for judging your time allocation. Fifth, a good structure makes it easier for you to punt material. Some months back, we talked about how you have to be ready to punt material if time changes or something goes wrong and you don't have as much time. If you understand the structure of your presentation, understand how the different points fit in, instead of thinking about having to cut this slide or that slide or just the last 10 slides of your presentation if you run out of time, understanding the structure means that you can make a decision to cut 3 or 4 or 5 supporting points and still make your argument and still understand how everything is going to matter. It means that when you have to go ahead and punt material at the last minute, you can punt the least important and the least effective material instead of the most important or most effective material because you know where that is and how that fits into your overall argument. 6, it makes it easier to retain your content. When you're delivering a presentation, you want to know what you're talking about and where you're talking about it and what content is going to come up next. It's difficult for you to have 30 or 40 slides all memorized or a whole bunch of individual stories and things that just go straight in a random sequence. And it's harder to keep that in mind. It's harder to retain all of that. And when you try to do that as a speaker, what you often end up doing is speaking to your slides, meaning that you look at the slide that's on the screen to determine what you're going to talk about. And then you change your slide, you look at the next slide, and then you know what you're going to talk about that time because you don't have everything easily retained. But when you have a good structure on your presentation, you understand how the different points fit together, how the different sections fit together. And you can go from point 1 to point 2 and talk about point 2 because you know how it relates to point 1. Everything is going to flow naturally towards that to ultimately support that main point. It makes it easier for you to retain the most important information in your presentation so that you can be effective with your audience. And when you have good, clear structure instead of a rambling collection of thoughts, it makes it easier for your audience to retain that information as well. And speaking of your audience, number 7, it makes it easier for your audience to follow along with you. Last week I talked about how building a talk is sort of like preparing for a road trip. The structure of your presentation is essentially that roadmap. And when you have a good structure, you have a good map. You can see how you're getting from where you are now to where you are going. And you can share that map with your audience so your audience can follow along with you. They can spend their time and their attention understanding what you're talking about and understanding how that fits in with the other things that you're going to be saying over the course of your time. See, your audience is always trying to process what you're saying. And in the back of their mind, they're also trying to figure out, okay, why should I care about this? What's in it for me? Why did the speaker bring that up? When you have a good structure around your talk, you are giving context to each of your slides. So you're giving context to each of the points and each of the arguments that you are making for your audience. And when you are providing them with that context, both beforehand and as you are speaking, it makes it a lot easier for them to focus on what you're saying because they don't have to spend as much time trying to figure out just what the heck you're talking about and why this matters now. And you can see that how this comes to play in even the structure of this episode of the podcast. So I started out this topic talking about the 3 things that we're going to do: explain what structure is, explain why structure matters, and finally explain what structure and signposting is. So now that we're in the middle of it, we're talking about why it matters, you see how that all fits together. If I just started putting out these little bits and pieces throughout the time that I'm talking here, it wouldn't make as much sense. You'd be trying in your mind to stitch everything together into a coherent narrative. The structure I define ahead of time makes it easier for you to follow that narrative. 8th, it makes it easier to take action. And ultimately, that's the most important aspect of your presentation. You are speaking with that audience because you want to inspire them to do something, whether that's going to be make a change, whether that's going to be start a project, start doing some work, process stuff, think about something, learn something, remember things. Whatever the particular action you want your audience to take, if you have good structure in place, it's easier for them to take that action because by the time that you are done, they understand why they should take that action, how they're going to benefit from it, and they understand what you are going to want them to do. Additionally, when they walk away from that presentation, we've already talked about how your audience is probably going to only remember, maybe 15% of what you say, and it's your responsibility to define the 15% that they retain. With good structure, they will remember what action you wanted them to take. And they will hopefully also remember the main reasons why you want them to take that action, because you called that out in the structure of your talk. If your talk has no structure, if it doesn't have that broader outline, if it doesn't clarify those different points that you want to make and why they should be doing that, then your audience is going to try and digest, however long material, 30, 45, 50 minutes of material where you just went from one slide to another without a coherent narrative. And at that point, it's not information, it's trivia. If you have good structure in place, you give your audience the resources they need to take action. And ultimately, action is the whole point of what we're doing. So I've talked about what structure is and why it matters. So now let's talk about signposting, like that sentence I just said. Back in college, I had a professor in one of my classes, actually in several of my classes, who had some challenges with his signposting. So he would be going through the lecture and he would get to an aspect of organizational communications or whatever it was we were talking about. And he would say, I have 5 points to make about this, or there are 5 things you need to remember about this. And then he would introduce them and I would go ahead and take notes, and it would turn out there were only like 3 things mentioned in there. And then by the time the exam rolled around, the question would be, what are the 6 things we described about this topic? There was a complete mismatch between his signposting, the actual content he delivered, and then the way he quizzed us on that material. Eventually, a number of people in class got together and raised this concern with the professor. And in the next class, he sort of thought he was being kind of snarky when he said, okay, there are 5 points I'm going to make here. Point number 1 is, point number 2 is, point number 3 is, point number 4 is, point number 5 is, with sort of a smirk. But the thing is, that was actually what we wanted him to do all along, because now our notes would match the lecture, would match the test material, and it would ensure that everything that he actually wanted to communicate with us, he was able to communicate with us. Signposting is those elements in a talk that tell you where you are in the talk and what's coming up. They're things like when I say there are 8 things I'm going to talk about here, first, second, third, fourth, etc. And then as I go through the talk, I, again, give a number to each of those things so you can see where we are. First, second, third, fourth, those are all great elements of signposting. Other common words when you're talking about signposting is when, as a speaker, you move from one point to another and you go, okay, let's talk about this next, or now let's talk about this. Or when you refer back and you talk about, in my previous point, I talked about this, or a few moments ago, I talked about this, or last week, I talked about this. An internal summary can be an element of the signposting where it's like, okay, now that we've talked about these 8 things, let's move on, and we're going to talk about this next major point, which is signposting. All those things give your audience clues to the structure. And the more explicit you are with your signposting, the easier it can be for many audiences to follow along with what you're doing. If your signposting is super clear, your audience can probably go ahead and recreate the outline that you actually used to build your talk. And of course, depending on the material that you're talking about and where it falls into the content heavy versus heavy inspiration, you may be more or less explicit with your signposting. But your signposting, helping people move from now to the next, from where you are to where you were going to be, really helps them stay along with you. Just like when we're following that road trip, when we're following that map to get from our beginning to our destination, that's signposting along the way, which tells us where the exits are and where the next freeway intersection is. All of that helps us ultimately stay on track for what we want to accomplish. Because you see, a good structure is going to help both you and your audience to develop your content, to learn and retain your content, and ultimately to go ahead and take action. And just like when an 8-year-old is playing with heavy wooden blocks, a good structure will make your presentations both more interesting and less likely to collapse on your audience's head. So whenever you prepare a presentation, think about the structure. Think about what it is. Think about why it matters. And then think about how to signpost it throughout your actual discussion. What are your thoughts on structure? Go ahead and let us know in the comments for episode 37 at 2minutetalktips.com. Is there a topic you'd like to hear more about in a future episode of 2-Minute Talk Tips? Go ahead and give us a call and leave a message at 650-TALK-TIP. That's 650-825-5847. Or shoot me an email at bill@2minutetalktips.com. I'd also appreciate it if you would share this episode with a friend, colleague, or relative and help them subscribe to 2-Minute Talk Tips. And as with every episode, don't get best, get better. Thank you, and I'll see you next week.